I am Ashutosh Dutta from Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab. I also serve as the chair for recently formed Baltimore chapter, ACM Baltimore chapter. And I know some of you did join on February 24th when we had the kickoff. And this is the second seminar we are doing. Thank you for joining, and thank you those who are on site. We have food, sandwiches, so if you're nearby, please do come next time we do it at APL. But we are planning to actually rotate it a little bit to do sometimes at APL, sometimes at UMBC or Johns Hopkins University, University of Maryland, so we can people around can join as well. So I will I'll be joined with my colleagues today to get this going. And I will have a little bit of introductory talks before I get there. So this is me, work for Johns Hopkins, Applied Physics Lab, Laurel, Baltimore. Laurel, I'm in Maryland, and this is a Baltimore chapter, so it caters to the needs of people around Maryland, DC, and Virginia. So people who are in this vicinity, they can even come and join us on site. Wi-Fi information, this is for the people who are on site. If you want to join the Wi-Fi, the guest Wi-Fi, you can join. And we are holding this seminar, building B201. This is a brand new building that came up within last few months. So if you're visiting APL, please do visit. So as I was telling, this is the second seminar, and we have interesting speakers, two speakers, and I'll introduce them very soon. This is the remote and in-person, so people who are dialing through Zoom. You can also go to Baltimore chapter website to take a look at the first seminar that we did and the recording as well. So there are two talks today by distinguished speakers. Professor Stephen Balobin from Columbia University. He'll be talking about 35 years of protecting the internet, historical retrospective. And Professor Anupam Josie from University of Maryland, Baltimore County, we're talking about AI for cybersecurity. So I'll give a little bit of introduction to ACM and not join, just to give you an idea what ACM is all about. Last time I had given a presentation, and if you want to be an ACM member or you want to be a volunteer, please join. And the local chapter and try to propose any specific seminar. We also collaborate with other chapters ACM has. For example, Princeton Central Jersey section, they have been actually sending our notices out there as well. So in terms of agenda, the networking refreshment part is over. I'm in the welcome address and ACM Baltimore chapter update. Then after that, we have Professor Stephen Balobin, who will be joining remotely from Columbia University. And there'll be a little break. And then Professor Anupam Josie from University of Maryland, Baltimore County, he's present here. He'll be speaking from on-site. And then we'll have a few things about future plans, future activities. With that, let me introduce my colleagues who are in the executive committee. For those who missed last time, I have Chavis, Vice Chair of ACM Chapter, Baltimore Chapter, Random Going Webmaster, Tamim Shakur, Secretary, Ken Smith, Membership Development, and Wale Akinpelu, who is the Treasurer. And Jeff and Wale will be taking the stage later on when they introduce the speakers. So I'd like to thank all my colleagues who have helped put this event together, and also the AV folks and APL management who have been encouraging this activity all along. Just to mention Dr. Ralph Semmel, who was instrumental in getting this ACM chapter started. I'd like to thank him and all the other management. Brief introduction. We have Professor Stephen Belovin, 35 years of protecting the internet. You'll hear from him. And the second talk is AI for cybersecurity from Professor Anupam, Josie. I wanted to give little but glimpses of the first seminar because many of you missed that, and it's important to get a glimpse of what other speakers told. And I'll also send you the pointer to the talks that have been recorded and have been archived, right? So last time we had Professor Gabriel Kotsis, she's the ACM president, and Dr. Ralph Semmel, director of JHU-APL, Professor Leonard Kleinrock from UCLA, Dr. Epkel Erickson from NASA, and Professor Henning Schelgerin from Columbia University. So last time the theme was internet, digital, how to take care of the digital divide, different technology that NASA was developing. And today's theme is on security. So you'll get a history of internet security and what's happening today and going forward, AI and cybersecurity. So just glimpses some of the pictures. If you go to ACM website, you will see that. And this is Johns Hopkins APL building, 201. So if you please do visit next time, and these are some of the glimpses, the pictures. I'll play a pretty small clip of some. I'm Ashutosh Dutta from Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, also the chair for ACM Baltimore chapter. I'm going to introduce my fellow colleagues in the organizing committee and the executive committee. So at this time, I will have the video recording from ACM President Professor Gabriel Kotsis. Professor Kotsis, she's an Austrian computer scientist. She's a distinguished member of ACM, and she's the current ACM president.
Welcome to the kickoff meeting of the ACM Baltimore chapter. I would like to begin by congratulating Ashutosh Dutta, chair of the chapter, and Jeffrey Chavis, vice chair, and all the other officers for starting this regional chapter. ACM itself was established in 1947 by a small group of researchers interested in computing machinery. As the field of computing has grown from that interest by a few people in 1947 to being a part of virtually every aspect of our lives, it is even more important to join our forces in the community to ensure that our activities remain true to the original vision of ACM.
Congratulations on your 75th anniversary. It doesn't seem like very long ago that we at APL marked our 75th, and we are now quickly approaching our 80th anniversary. It is amazing to consider just how much has changed in the lifespans of our organizations, and yet how critical both of our institutions remain to the challenges we face in the world today.
It's my pleasure to discuss with you, if you will, the origins of the internet. You heard some of the elements in that introduction earlier. I'm going to fill in some of the details. 1969, going back a few years, was an incredible year. First man landed on the moon. A bunch of young people were dancing all over up in New York State. An event with probability 0 occurred. First 747 took to the flight. Oh, and by the way, the internet was born.
Dr. April Erickson has held numerous positions during her 27-plus year tenure with NASA. On a personal note, remember Dr. Erickson, we both were at Howard University at the same time, and I remember her working on her PhD while she was at Howard. And I will say that watching her go through that was part of the motivation that got me to the point where I eventually got my doctorate. So thank you for that motivation, Dr. Erickson.
So with COVID, I think a lot of us have been very determined, and I say, grit, even in the face of failure, but, with COVID, we could not fail. I think of myself as a kid, this little brown girl who grew up in the projects in Brooklyn, New York, and I was a tom girl. As you can see, don't I look a little rough and tough here? Got the little baseball bat going on, and believe it or not, even though my mother argued for me to be on the baseball team, I never got to play. I sat on the bench and watched, and the same thing happened with basketball because it just didn't let girls do that kind of stuff. But I was one of those kids that was determined. And so there you go. You can see me playing all kinds of sports. I believe that, there's a lot to be said with learning how to work with men. And so sports did that for me. And it allowed me to really continue to have that grit to succeed in the face of the fact that I'm in a field that is dominated by men.
What I want to convince you of is that one of the more important, but also, fortunately, one of the more solvable problems, both in the United States and internationally, is now that the internet is technically mature, how do we make sure that everybody who wants to get on can get on and enjoy the benefits of the technology?
We encourage you also that if you participate here, your organization, I'm sure, will support you also to become fellows of the future. So I will encourage all of you, take advantage of this and become fellows in the future and be like all our distinguished guests that came here today.
Thank you. So now that you saw the clips, if you want to look at all the talks, the complete talk and the talks by the three speakers, you can visit Baltimore chapter website, baltimore.acm.org. And they have been put in the ACM YouTube channel. You can also visit ACM YouTube channel to take a look. So please do visit. If you have any suggestions, questions, please let us know. So those are some of the glimpses and recordings just to make sure. And this is also will be recorded, so you'll be able to take a look. So as I was telling last time, we have few things planned for Baltimore chapter. The next one, I announced it last time, Next G Summit. That's going to take place also at APL. So the call for proposal, speaking proposal is still out there. May 1st is the deadline. And there are 4 different tracks. So if you want to speak, please send your proposal. And the website is right there. You can just go to the website and submit your proposal through EDAS. We also found there has been a lot of interest in Open RAN. This is as part of the Radio Access Network, which is open, and ORAN Alliance has been formed recently. So we are going to partner with IEEE Standards Association and Future Network Initiative, who has been looking into Open RAN. So May 26, we are going to have another summit, again at APL, in a different location, the K Center, and there's going to be free as well. So please plan these 2 dates. At the same time, we are also going to have the next edition, 3rd edition of the seminar pretty soon. With that, I'd like to invite my colleague, Wale Akinpelu, to come to stage and introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Ashutosh. Before I introduce our first speaker, I want to remind those on Zoom, if you have any questions for the speaker, please make sure you post them online. Our first speaker for today is Dr. Stephen M. Belovin. He is the Percy K. and Vida L. W. Hodgson Professor of Computer Science at Columbia University. He's a member of the Cybersecurity and Privacy Center of the university's Data Science Institute and an affiliate faculty member at Columbia Law School. Steve does research on security and privacy and on related public policy issues. In his copious spare professional time, he does some work on the history of cryptography. He joined the faculty of Columbia University in 2005 after over 30 years at Bell Labs and AT&T Labs Research, where he was appointed as an AT&T Fellow, which is the highest honor a technical person can receive within AT&T. He received a BA degree from Columbia University and an MS and PhD in computer science from University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. While at UNC as a graduate student, Steve and 2 other collaborators created Usenet. In 1995, Steve and his collaborators received the Usenix Lifetime Achievement Award. Steve has also received the 2007 NIST and NSA National Computer System Security Award and has been elected to the Cybersecurity Hall of Fame. He has served as Chief Technologist of the Federal Trade Commission and as a technology scholar at the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. He is a member of the National Academy of Engineering and has served on the Computer Science and Telecommunications Board of the National Academies of Sciences engineering, and medicine. In the past, he has been a member of the Department of Homeland Security Science, Technology, and Advisory Committee, and the Technical Guidelines Development Committee of the Election Assistance Commission. On a personal note, Steve was my role model when I joined Bell Labs in the 80s. He was one of the strong supporters when I proposed the creation of social.culture.african news group. For this, I'm eternally grateful. It is my honor and privilege to present to you Dr. Stephen M. Belovin. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Wale. I remember those days fondly. Thank you all for inviting me to come speak here. So, to start 1988, which is approximately 35 years ago. In fact, the actual story goes back a little bit further than a year or two earlier than 1988. In May of 88, Cliff Stoll published an article in CACM called Stalking the Wile Hacker. He described how his site was hacked and how he monitored the hacker and traced him. And his book, The Cuckoo's Egg, came out in 1989. Also in 88, the first internet worm was launched. But all these problems are solved, right? Well, let's take a look back. In 86, Stoll was an astronomer working as a system administrator at Lawrence Berkeley Labs. And back in those days, you charge people for computer time, just like you do today on something like AWS. And he noticed a 75-cent accounting discrepancy. Things didn't balance right because the accounting system was locally written and not known to everybody else. And that led him to find a hacker. Tracking down the hacker took almost a year. And the attacker characteristics were interesting. Penetrations were mostly happening by password compromise. There were default passwords like system and manager, field and service, guest and guest, and even open accounts with no passwords. Users shared passwords via email and stored their passwords in files. There was even password guessing, though Stoll didn't realize that until fairly late in the game. And bugs in the system were used for privilege escalation to gain root privileges. The attacker was hard to trace because of the use of stepping stones. They didn't go directly into his machine. They went into his machine from other stepping stone machines. And he tried getting various people at the administrative level, layer 9 of the network, if you will, interested. And when he went to the FBI, they said, 75-cent loss, go away, we're not interested. The CIA was interested. I thought this was fascinating. And the NSA was extremely interested. They wanted to know not just about the attacker's techniques, but how he was monitoring the attacker. And management said basically, why are you wasting your time on this? He traced the attack to Germany, wanted to get a wiretap warrant, search warrant, what have you. And German bureaucracy, law enforcement, quite properly replied that they were not going to do a sort of wiretap without a proper search warrant. And because this was a crime taking place in the US, they had to be notified properly and officially by the appropriate US government agency. I now know that would be something called an MLAT, Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty. But his friend's reaction, those reactions you might see today, though the FBI would probably be more interested. One of his friend's reactions were rather different. One said, so what? Someone's always had control over information. Others always tried to steal it. Read Machiavelli. As technology changes, sneakiness finds new expressions. Someone else replied, a computer system isn't private like a house. Lots of people use it for many purposes. Just because this guy doesn't have official permission to use it doesn't necessarily mean he has no legitimate purpose in being there. But Cliff himself wrote that whenever a fun-loving student breaks into systems as a game, as I might once have done, forgets that he's invading people's privacy, endangering data that others have sweated over, sowing distrust and paranoia. That's ultimately, I think, where we have come down today. And Stoll decided to try to trace the attacker. Well, he needed to keep the attacker on for long enough to actually trace. So he created what today we would call a honeypot. And since he noticed the attacker seems to be poking around for defense-related information, he created fake documents, and especially an index pointing to such documents, about the Strategic Defense Initiative, an anti-missile system popularly known at the time as Star Wars. And the attacker fell for the bait. The attacker was trying to find more such information on the system, which of course didn't exist on that computer because these documents were all fake. And somebody, probably a Soviet bloc agent, even sent a physical letter asking for more documents. Well, that actually got the FBI interested. And Stoll's analysis was that passwords were a problem. A memorable one password was guessable. A random password somebody would store in a file. So either way you slice passwords, they were going to be a problem. Systems were not secure as shipped. There were these default accounts like guest and field and service and so on. And Bob Morris, who I originally met when we were together at Bell Labs, who later became chief scientist of the NSA's National Computer Security Center, was also, among his many other virtues, a pioneer in usable security. Secure computers might keep the bad guys out, but if they're so bulky that no one will use them, it won't be much progress. Cliff also noticed that people weren't installing patches, and he confronted the problem well before most other people did of how do you do responsible disclosure of vulnerabilities. And when he contacted sites from which the attacks were coming, even in 1986, long before the commercial internet, many people had already experienced problems with hackers. Most hosts were not on the internet, but dial-up modems were quite common. And attack techniques, even then, included dumpster diving and social engineering. The attackers wanted shell access and then root or equivalent access, system access at a high level. The other interesting thing that happened in '88 was the internet worm. It was in fact, was an advance over most of its successors. It was multi-platform, running on VAXs and Sun 3s. It was multi-vector, used a hole and send mail, the mail daemon, a buffer overflow in program was FingerD, password guessing, transitive trust. The payload was encrypted. It didn't do anything malicious, but it had exponential growth and clogged hosts and links. So 1988 anticipated a lot of what we're going to see in coming years and decades. And the 1990s, the big thing that happened was the World Wide Web and the commercialization of the internet. And the response at the time was firewalls. And Stoll noted in his book, securing one computer is like securing an apartment house. Probably can do it. But if you have a network of computers, that's like securing a small city. My longtime friend and colleague from Bell Labs, Bill Cheswick, says like circling the wagons around the state of Montana. You can't do it. Bob Morris was trying to do it, but it was hard. But too many machines were vulnerable. They were being administered by different people. Hardening them all was too hard. We needed a scalable solution, and that was the firewall. the notion of a single gateway host for an organization wasn't new. You know, I brought that to my lab when I joined Bell Labs in '82. Security was one of my motives, though far from the only one. But a lot of people were thinking about single gateway hosts. The first modern packet filter was done by Jeff Mogul and colleagues in 1989. Deborah Estrin and Gene Sutik had cryptographic network access control in '89. Bill Cheswick did an application firewall in 1990. And when Bill and I wrote the first book on internet security in '94, we came up with more or less, call it a theory of firewalls. And around that time, with the internet becoming commercial, we started seeing commercial firewalls. And why did Bill and I think that firewalls were a good idea? Oh, how central computers were vulnerable. Terminals only let read data. Well, you could export things, and there were internet connected computers. Firewalls had a smaller attack surface in today's terminology. A firewall would be administered by someone who cared about security rather than someone whose just job was to keep the system running. It was a choke point. We called it customs inspection for traffic. You could put more logging in there. But fundamentally, I viewed it as dealing with the buggy host problem. In a talk I gave in '94, I wrote that the firewalls were the network response to a host security problem. Computers were too insecure, and a firewall was a scalable solution in a way that trying to secure each of the many thousands of computers inside, say, Bell Labs was not scalable. But firewalls had their limits, and we noted them at the time. We know that firewalls would protect you against attacks at a lower level of the stack, but no protection against problems with higher level protocols, like email and web. And we knew this in '94. There was a problem in the mail system, SendMail, that if you said certain header lines, you could trigger bugs. And since our firewall was only operating at a lower level, it didn't notice these. You didn't have too much bypass of firewalls then. The technology didn't quite exist, though we realized very early on that you could create tunnels to bypass firewalls. Those are still used. The web was just beginning in '94. In fact, one of the last things we added to the book before it went to press was a few paragraphs about HTTP, and we declined a suggestion to list internet resources using this newfangled idea called the URL. Importantly, firewalls depend on topology. If there's connectivity that doesn't pass through the choke point, the firewall provides no protection. And a modern corporation has very many holes through and around its firewall. So the web came along as consumer accessible around '94. It was started a few years earlier. It made the internet accessible to ordinary users, people who weren't fond of command line FTP, for example. Consumer ISPs started to appear with no firewalls. That wasn't quite the issue because the web wasn't quite an attack vector. This was still the era of PC viruses, which were being spread by floppy disks. And then some years after the 1988 internet worm, we saw worms starting to hit the internet. In '96, someone who went by the pseudonym of Aleph One, he's now a well-respected security expert, published an article called Smashing the Stack for Fun and Profit. It was a cookbook recipe for how to carry out buffer overflow attacks. Many new sites joined the internet. These people were very smart. The people administering the machines were very smart, but they weren't battle hardened. They didn't know what it took to guard a computer against a knowledgeable attacker. And code bases, Microsoft's and everyone else's, grew much faster than quality control. This was the beginning of the first internet boom. And the mantra of a lot of companies seemed to be ship first, debug later. By the late 90s, many, arguably most consumer-facing companies had some presence on the web. That included financial institutions. Spammers appeared and discovered email. Many US military sites were penetrated. One penetration looked serious enough that national security personnel thought it was a foreign intelligence agency. It turned out to be teenagers from Israel and California. And the NSA was proactive. In the Operation Eligible Receiver, they showed that starting from a dial-up modem, you could get to the US power grid. I note that that's still an issue today. And because we had so many buggy hosts, it was possible to create worms that would spread very quickly. The I love you worm spread via email, which passed through most firewalls, and low-grade social engineering. Click here to see a nude picture of so-and-so. The SQL slammer worm spread via UDP. One packet, poof, you're infected. Code Red could infect a Microsoft web server, and it turned out that a lot of applications on Windows laptops installed IIS and a database server. You didn't think you were running a database server or a web server, but you were. Most of these worms had no particular goal other than, but they clogged the net, exponential growth. So badly so that the blaster worm had generated so much traffic, it blocked the CSX railroad signaling network. There was a lot more buggy code than defenders imagined. A lot of it was not stopped by firewalls. I love you as email. In those days, you didn't have virus scanning, worm scanning at their email gateways. Traveling laptops at conferences were infected and brought it home. I was at Code Red hit. I was actually at the IETF meeting in London. So I quickly coded up a little packet sniffer intrusion detection to see if anyone was going to try to attack my laptop, which was not running Windows. And yeah, I saw a lot of attacks coming from the IETF conference network. And all of these computers were going to go back home next week and infect their corporate networks. VPNs were not yet common. Family members often shared the employee's laptop. There were business-to-business links that bypassed the firewall. So one of our properties for firewalls, a topological choke point and attacks at a lower level, two of our properties no longer held. How did hackers receive training? Self-taught online resources, things like the publication, a 2600 magazine, which bills itself as the Hacker Quarterly, networking with other hackers. Probably there are other countries' intelligence agencies starting to look at this stuff, though I don't know that. The Cliff Stoll's attackers turned out to be some 20-something West Germans who were trying to find American defense documents to sell to the Stasi, the East German secret police, which would turn it over to the KGB to get money for cocaine. So there were foreign intelligence implications even in the mid to late 1980s. And in mid-2000s, there was a phase change in attacks that it took attackers a while to catch on to. Around 2003, the destructive worms stopped happening. And there were other worms, but they didn't seem to be destructive. And no one quite understood why. The New York Times actually ran a story on this. It was high quality software, but what was its purpose? And Mikko Iponen said, it's money. And he was right. The attackers had figured out that there was money to be made from hacking. Worms that shut down the internet, it turns out, are bad for business. Besides, why waste time on joy hacking when you can profit from your skills? So how about spam? Spam was originally sent via open relays. Connect to an open SMTP relay on the internet and let it send out the spam to everybody else. Those were being closed down by this point. But there are authorized machines that could send spam. So hack the endpoint and let it send the spam. The spammers paid the hackers. So there was now a profit motive for hacking. And the market worked its magic. It was, there was now demand for hacking. Illicit, but demand. The market worked. And we started seeing online banking. And that also attracted criminals. People were logging into their banks with passwords. Phishing emails, keystroke loggers could collect those passwords. And again, email passes through most firewalls. There were drive-by downloads and buggy code. For example, there was a very popular, now thankfully gone, plug into many browsers called Flash. It was the only way to animate things in those days. It had a horrible reputation for being buggy. And you could use this to take over somebody's computer, plant a keystroke logger, get their bank password. The theoretical solution to all of this was a certificate telling you that you're at your bank's website. But the difference between theory and practice is that in theory there is no difference, in practice there is. The average consumer has no idea what a certificate is, at least in the cryptographic sense, and doesn't know to check for it. People didn't notice the absence of a correct certificate. Their browser would have warned them if the certificate was for somebody else, but there was no certificate at all, and people didn't notice. But things started getting better in another ways. Software quality started to improve. The Gartner Group, a major corporate consulting outfit, warned its clients to get rid of IIS, the Microsoft Web Server. And Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, who were running Microsoft at the time, saw this as an existential threat to the company. When an open source web server like Apache was more secure and preferred over one of their flagship products, that was bad. And what was going to happen to them when desktop operating systems and server operating systems followed the same path? And there's also an economic fact. The dot-com boom turned into a bust. A lot of smaller companies and startups went out of business. So there's less pressure to ship fast. There's time to get your code right, but no one, and that includes Microsoft, had time to rewrite all of the old buggy code. Microsoft put a lot of effort into securing new code, but they couldn't rewrite everything. And you needed backwards compatibility, even if sometimes the interfaces themselves were a flaw. So what you ended up with a situation where all operating systems and most applications would alert users to patches. Microsoft instituted Patch Tuesday, a scheduled release of updates to ease the load on system administrators. Yeah, sometimes there'll be a serious enough attack in the wild that they'll ship an out-of-cycle patch, but mostly they don't. Why not? Because attackers reverse engineer the patches and find new bugs that If people haven't installed this patch, then the attackers can use this knowledge that they gained by looking at the patch that Microsoft has installed, as distributed. And you can't be too quick to patch a system. Patches will brick systems or cause other serious problems. You know, there's one release of iOS where a lot of people suddenly couldn't make phone calls anymore. Since an iPhone is nominally a phone, not being able to make a phone call is a fairly serious problem. It took about 2 days for Apple to fix that, but that sort of thing can happen. And by 2009, the militaries of the world were taking very serious notice of the internet. The internet is now part of most countries' critical infrastructure. Targets attract weapons, information attracts spies, and the militaries and intelligence agencies of the world understand this. You know, most notably, there was Stuxnet, which widely attributed to the NSA and Israeli intelligence unit 8200. And it seriously set back Iran's nuclear uranium centrifuge enrichment plant. And phishing grew up. It became spear phishing, going after a particular target. Rather than send a broad message, you know, I love when I get a message telling me that my account at the Royal Bank of Halifax, I need to change my password because I don't have an account at the Royal Bank of Halifax, so I can just laugh at it. But with spear phishing, you learn something about your target. The HR person might like resumes. Researchers look at papers in their area. Use lures aimed at your target. A few years ago, I got emails purporting to be from my department chair or my dean, asking me to buy iTunes gift cards. They'll reimburse me later. There was notorious penetration of RSA Labs with a spreadsheet of hiring plans sent to somebody in HR. It went to the spam folder, but the HR person was very conscientious and retrieved the email from the spam folder and opened it. Very conscientious. It infected the whole company, probably sent by an intelligence agency. And today's high-end attackers are very skillful and have vast resources. They're often intelligence agencies. Spear phishing works better if you know a lot about the target, but lesser threats are still serious when employed by skilled agents. I mean, you've got some really complicated exploit. Why use it against a target that will fall for a simple one? And it turns out these days that even less developed countries can rapidly build up sophisticated military hacking skills. So much so that even the New York Times has taken notice, article the last couple of years about how rapidly Iran and North Korea have come up to speed. And no one figured that North Korea was going to, because they're not on the internet. Where were their people learning their skills? Well, there's enough information out there. It doesn't take too much. So a lot of countries have developed fairly sophisticated, quite sophisticated military hacking skills. Of course, the operating systems have improved. Today's defenses are quite good, albeit not perfect. 15 years ago, buffer overflows were at least half of all attacks. Technology stopped most of that. We've got things like stack canaries and so on. Stops stack-based buffer overflows in its tracks. But we now have things like return-oriented programming and other code reuse attacks. The attackers aren't going away. You're not going to stop today's sophisticated attackers with one technological fix. You will find one fix and they'll find another hole. Just today, I read a story about from a report out of Google's Project Zero, talking about the zero-day attacks, ones for which no patch exists. Most of them they found were quite easy to find, took a very little effort to find these holes. There were only two they found that were sophisticated, and those came from a Israeli company called NSO. But today's exploits are multi-stage because we've got multiple layers of defense. You get a beachhead, for example, infect a browser. But today's browsers are sandboxed. So the next step is, do you find another exploit that lets you escape the sandbox on that platform? And then you do privilege escalation, become root or administrator on that machine. A penetration then is chaining together multiple vulnerabilities to penetrate a system. But this is not imaginary. This is what's happening in the real world today. And, you know, there's a saying I've heard attributed to submariners that there are two kinds of Navy vessels, submarines and targets. The internet has become a target-rich environment. It's other countries' government and military infrastructure. It's other critical infrastructure like the power grid and the water supply system. Well-placed monitoring points, though that I might add is not new. In 1993, there was a CERT advisory about password monitoring on the internet. Well, the attackers then were able to, based on the topology of the time, were able to plant their password monitoring technology on machines that were on the internet backbone. Way to construct a new operating system secure by its nature? Probably not. One reason is backward compatibility is all about the applications. And a high percentage of security problems are not in the code, they're in the specs. You know, using a memory safe language will get us a lot of the way there, but it's not going to help you against a bug in the spec. You know, about once every 3 to 4 or 5 months, I see a flaw that relies on someone going after specifying a path name of .. // // whatever / password. That's not a new attack. I was certainly personally was aware of that in 1979. It still happens today. It's not just the operating systems. One of the mistakes that we made, a wrong turn that we made in the early 80s, I'd say through the 90s, was the assumption that all that mattered was operating system security. That's good, that's important, but it's application security that matters. To me, a secure operating system is one that makes it easy to write secure applications, but nothing's perfect. You know, so Windows 11 is extraordinarily secure. This month, Patch Tuesday had 145 flaws, 10 of them critical, one of them being actively exploited. And this is despite almost 20 years of Microsoft software development lifecycle. It's a hard problem. But attackers going after defense contractors, commercial technology, personal information database. When Equifax was hacked about 5 years ago, probably by an intelligence agency, stole data on 150 million Americans. Office of Personnel Management, tens of millions of federal employees, including information on people with security clearances. Dissidents, more or less anything else imaginable, is being targeted today. And even the ordinary thieves are better. Why steal credit cards one number at a time, say with a keystroke logger, when you can hack a server and steal 50 million at a time, as happened to Target and Home Depot? We're seeing massive thefts of information. Marriott and Quora have disclosed massive breaches of hundreds of millions of users' data taken. Marriott, it took them 4.5 years to notice the problem. There's a line attributed to the famed bank robber Willie Sutton. He never actually said it. Why rob banks? That's where the money is. Why hack computers on the internet? That's where the information is. Phishing, we know how to defeat. You can use two-factor authentication. Corporations have used this for a very long time. Cheswick and I discussed this in '94. Consumers are starting to use it too. Phones have become the most common second factor because almost everybody's got a smartphone. It could be via an app, which is reasonably secure, or a text message, not nearly as secure, but far better than just a password. The best technology out there today is probably a FIDO2 key, because that authenticates the actual endpoint cryptographically, but those are still not that common. Patching has grown up too. Microsoft and Google, at least in the consumer space, don't wait for users to download patches. They push patches out to their users. But some of these patches still break things. Corporations are realizing the importance of speedy patching. It's hard to patch when you're a corporation because you've got custom software that the patch couldn't have been tested against, and it might break. But many corporations have development and deployment styles that are amenable to rapid patching. Like Checkpoint, you snapshot your virtual machine, do the patch, spin up a new VM, and if it breaks something, then you can revert to the earlier snapshot. Equifax was hacked because they had, if I recall correctly, 117 web servers, and 116 of them were patched. Well, the attackers found the 117th. So where are we today? Today, we're getting dual threats: hostile militaries and ransomware. A major plague of ransomware. Ransomware attackers will encrypt your files and sometimes your online backups. Hint, keep at least one backup offline. And they demand payment in cryptocurrencies, preferably the untraceable variety. And since some companies say, I have a good backup, I'm not going to pay you, they're coupling it with extortion. We're going to publish your sensitive files and not just rely on decryption. Healthcare facilities, municipal governments have been highly targeted by a lot of these ransomware operators. And over the last couple of months, we're seeing cyber weapons used in support of an actual real military operation. Russian military intelligence apparently used a variety of cyber weapons before and during their attack on Ukraine. They apparently knocked out some satellite terminals, not the satellite, the ground terminals across Europe, because the Ukrainian military was using these satellites to communicate. They've been going after the Ukrainian power grid. Again, the Ukrainians have so far managed to fight that one off. And the Ukrainians are not standing still. They've got their IT army, they're calling it, and a lot of sympathizers around the world who've been striking back at Russian companies and assets. And there's a lot of concern about Russian hackers, whether it's directly Russian intelligence or Russian criminals who are encouraged or tolerated by the Russian government to strike back at the West because of the sanctions and the military aid being given to Ukraine. So when it comes to cyber warfare, this is actually a fairly delicate time, and we don't know where this one's going. This hasn't happened before. And by the way, I apologize for the picture of the bear. This was Mount Rainier. It was misting. So those little white spots are raindrops. So where do we go in the future? Is there hope, or are we going to climb deeper out of the swamp? Formal methods of security are showing some promise. It's not, formal methods, people have been talking about them since before I started graduate school, and that's a very long time ago at this point. But we're able to apply formal methods to more and more systems, larger and larger systems. Agile development, agile deployment is allowing rapid testing and deployment. And today's large-scale systems involve many replicas. So you try out your attack. You try out your defense on a few replicas at a time and see what happens. If it doesn't work, you shut them down and spin up new virtual machines with the older system. How do cyber weapons work? No one answer. It depends on what the target is. When Russian military intelligence, the GRU, went after the Ukrainian power grid in 2015, it was an industrial control system. They could flip relays, flip switches, strip breakers to take the thing offline, take the power grid offline. Stuxnet worked by changing speeds on the centrifuges, driving out of spec and causing the centrifuge eventually to self-destruct. If it's a banking system, you might just go erase the entire disk. There was Typhoon, which went after an oil company in Saudi Arabia, and it tried to override the safety systems on the pipelines and refineries to cause the physical infrastructure to self-destruct. So there are a lot of different ways. It's especially serious when there's physical infrastructure controlled by computer, but destroying, wiping disk on a satellite ground station, you might have to roll a truck to fix that, and that knocks that communication out. So there's not one answer to what a cyber weapon is. It depends on what system it's going after and what it's targeting. Which raises interesting questions. If most of the targets on the internet are civilian, should the military defend the civilian parts of the net? I have a lock on my door. If somebody breaks in, I can call the New York City Police Department. But, I can't defend against hostile tanks and bombers. Do we want the military to try to defend a civilian part of the net? There are privacy issues, and sometimes attribution gets wrong, is wrong. And a lot of people don't trust the government with data, and they keep trying to mess with our cryptography. Internet of Things is a real threat today. Again, we have developers who aren't hardened to security, repetition of old mistakes. There's not an economic model for patching on devices that have outlived their support lifetime, and you get physical world consequences. We know how to solve Cliff Stoll's password problem. Password managers, two-factor authentication, but deployment's a challenge. We have more serious attackers. We can patch, but not for IoT. We have more information sharing among the defenders. There's still a buggy code problem. Attribution is hard, though sometimes possible. Usability is still a real concern. And Morris identified this around 86, 87. So are we climbing out of the swamp? I won't try to go through this chart for you right now. I think the situation has improved, but we have more serious attackers. And with that, I leave you for any last questions.
On behalf of the ACM Baltimore chapter, Steve, we extend our appreciation to you for your delivering invited talk, ACM Baltimore chapter inaugural seminar 2022, Lawrence, Maryland, April 20th, 2022. Thank you so much for your talk.
Congratulations on your 75th anniversary. It doesn't seem like very long ago that we at APL marked our 75th, and we are now quickly approaching our 80th anniversary. It is amazing to consider just how much has changed in the lifespans of our organizations, and yet how critical both of our institutions remain to the challenges we face in the world today.
It's my pleasure to discuss with you, if you will, the origins of the internet. You heard some of the elements in that introduction earlier. I'm going to fill in some of the details. 1969, going back a few years, was an incredible year. First man landed on the moon. A bunch of young people were dancing all over up in New York State. An event with probability 0 occurred. First 747 took to the flight. Oh, and by the way, the internet was born.
Dr. April Erickson has held numerous positions during her 27-plus year tenure with NASA. On a personal note, remember Dr. Erickson, we both were at Howard University at the same time, and I remember her working on her PhD while she was at Howard. And I will say that watching her go through that was part of the motivation that got me to the point where I eventually got my doctorate. So thank you for that motivation, Dr. Erickson.
So with COVID, I think a lot of us have been very determined, and I say, grit, even in the face of failure, but with COVID, we could not fail. I think of myself as a kid, this little brown girl who grew up in the projects in Brooklyn, New York, and I was a tom girl. As you can see, don't I look a little rough and tough here? Got the little baseball bat going on, and believe it or not, even though my mother argued for me to be on the baseball team, I never got to play. I sat on the bench and watched, and the same thing happened with basketball because they just didn't let girls do that kind of stuff. But I was one of those kids that was determined. And so there you go. You can see me playing all kinds of sports. I believe that, there's a lot to be said with learning how to work with men. And so sports did that for me. And it allowed me to really continue to have that grit to succeed in the face of the fact that I'm in a field that is dominated by men.
What I want to convince you of is that one of the more important, but also, fortunately, one of the more solvable problems, both in the United States and internationally, is now that the internet is technically mature, how do we make sure that everybody who wants to get on can get on and enjoy the benefits of the technology?
We encourage you also that if you participate here, your organization, I'm sure, will support you also to become fellows of the future. So I will encourage all of you, take advantage of this and become fellows in the future and be like all our distinguished guests that came here today.
My name is Jeffrey Chavis, and I'm the vice chair for the ACM Baltimore chapter. And I have the honor and pleasure to introduce our second speaker for the evening. Professor Anupam Josie will be giving a talk today on AI for cybersecurity. Anupam Josie is the Orris Family Professor and chair of the Computer Science and Electrical Engineering Department at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He is the director of UMBC's Center for Cybersecurity. He's a fellow of the IEEE. Dr. Josie obtained a Bachelor of Technology degree from IIT Delphi in 1989, and a master's and PhD from Purdue University in 1991 and 1993, respectively. His interests in research are in the broad area of network computing and intelligent systems, and his primary focus has been on data management and security, privacy in mobile and pervasive computing environments. He's also interested in policy-driven approaches to security and privacy. Dr. Josie has interest in semantic web and data, text, and web analytics, especially their applications to cybersecurity and healthcare. He has published over 275 technical papers with an H-index of 87 and over 2,500 citations for his work. He's been granted 9 patents and has obtained research support from the National Science Foundation, from NASA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, the U.S. Department of Defense, NIST, IBM, Microsoft, Qualcomm, Northrop Grumman, and Lockheed Martin, amongst others. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker for the evening, Professor Anupam Josie.
Thank you. I appreciate the kind words of welcome, and I truly appreciate the Baltimore chapter for inviting me to give a talk today. I will confess by stating that following giants of the field like Kleinrock and Schulzreen and Steve Bellowin and others, it's a hard task, but I will try. A couple of ACM plugs, if you would. So we are organizing, I'm the general chair of ACM's CodeSpy, which is the big conference on data security and privacy. And the 12th iteration of the conference is happening next week, right here in the Arundel Mills area. So if you haven't registered yet and would like to come, please go to codespy.org. There is also an option this time. We're running the conference in a hybrid mode, so there is an option to be remote and attend the conference. A great set of talks, wonderful invited speakers. So I hope you'll consider it's an ACM activity and it's in the area. Also, a plug for CACM. You know, there was a slide earlier, so I'm the one of the editors on the Viewpoint side. So if you have clever ideas about security and how to make things better, that's a good venue to consider in addition to any journals and conferences. So we heard from Professor Bellowin a very nice history of how the internet and its security evolved. I will be looking to the future on saying, you know, some of the challenges that Professor Bellowin had begun to identify in his last few slides about the future, about sort of state actors and adversaries. How do we defend against those kinds of actors? And the claim that we've been making, we've done some work in this space for the last few years with interesting results, is that AI can help. But a stronger claim I want to just make in the beginning, happy to discuss with you, with others offline, is that you actually need foundational research in AI to make that happen. It's not, I mean, a lot of the current work is just, let's take, you know, whatever is the current best deep learning method and throw it at this, but we need more. Anyways, I'll say some more about that. So if you look at the kind of the sophisticated actors that Professor Bellowin was describing at the end, right? Or if you are dealing with internal threats, whether by acts of omission or commission, there is a gap between what we do today, and I'll say a little bit more about that later, and what really needs to be done at scale to counter those kinds of adversaries. And as we begin, and again, it's a point identified by Professor Bellowin earlier, as we begin to move to cyber physical systems, right? Systems that combine the information world with real physical effects, I think these challenges grow. And you heard about Stuxnet. Professor Bellowin suggested attributions. Living in this area, I will be very careful not to suggest attributions on who may or may not have developed that system. But it combined some of the things that he was talking about: reconnaissance, monitoring, figuring out the behavior. The vector was a laptop of an employee who used to take the laptop between their home and the office, from what we understand. And a very deep understanding, not just of the penetration method, but of the Siemens PLC that controlled those centrifuges, how those centrifuges were monitored, because believe it or not, there are people who are actually monitoring how those centrifuges were operating, and exactly what you needed to do in terms of accelerating and deaccelerating the spin to cause them to physically fail. So there was a cyber attack which was informed by the physics of the centrifuges, and which actively subverted the monitoring system. So allegedly, the people who were monitoring it didn't see that something strange was happening, because otherwise, if the centrifuges were speeding up and slowing down, the engineer monitoring them would have shut them down. That's not supposed to happen. So the claim I'm making is that to sort of address these kinds of challenges, you need fundamental research in AI, foundational work. And I will talk about some of the work that we have begun to do in this space. I do want to give a shout out in the audience. I mean, from UMBC, we have a ton of alums at APL. In fact, we very proudly claim that Dr. Ralph Semmel is an alum of our department, but there are a lot of alums, some of the names I see on the screen. So, thank you for coming, and thank you for APL for being such a good partner to UMBC. So I'm going to talk a little bit just on traditional, not so much on cyber physical for a minute, but just defending traditional computer systems with information that an adversary might want. And if you look at what happens today, right? The APT kind of attacks, as you heard from Professor Bellowin, unfold over a temporal scale, right? This is not a DDoS attack that someone is trying to bring you down. It's very easy to detect when you're being attacked using DDoS, right? These are sophisticated actors that are slowly pushing the boundaries here or there. So you have this attack unfolding over a temporal period, and it's typically not an attack on a single component of your system. It's not your firewall that's being hit, and that's all you need to. Maybe something was done to your firewall. Maybe one of the accounts was taken over. Maybe some file was changed. And this is all happening in a distributed manner. So geographically and spatially and temporally sort of separate. And what you want right now, what is sort of the state of the art, is you rely on Superwoman, right? So there is a person, watch standing, seeing whatever SIEM system you have, looking at various events that are happening, and in their head saying, aha, this thing happened 7 days ago. I read an article 3 days ago that said that people were beginning to exploit this kind of a vulnerability. I know that I have that kind of software installed in my system. I suddenly noticed that that process is running and touching files that it doesn't normally touch. And I noticed that a network connection has been opened to, a server that this system has never previously, all of these are relatively innocent things by themselves, but having a smart analyst, a Superwoman, if you would put them together, is what the state of the art is. And this is simply not scalable, right? Because maybe if you are APL, you can afford to have a few of these really, really smart people defending your networks. At UMBC, we have one full-time staff member and students, right? Graduate and undergraduate students that are our network defense. And we are representative of most of the real world. So to the extent that AI can step in and augment the human resources, right? With humans both in the detection loop and on the detection loop, or actually I would say the detection and response loop than what it is. So here's a simple example, right? Which current systems find hard to understand. So this is Petya, which was 2016. And on the right-hand side, you have not Petya, which was 2017. And it's doing the same thing, except the attack vector changed. And that is sufficient to defeat most modern systems, right? But as a human being, even minimally trained in cybersecurity, looking at this, I would say, yep, this is the same thing, right? This is an attack. This is a ransomware attack. Okay, so as I was mentioning to you, this is a particular APT Reaper, and you will notice that there's sort of a 2-year, almost 3-year time span, right? Over which multiple CVEs are being deployed. I'll say a little bit more about this. Right. In this slide, and this is thanks to our friends at MITRE, and this is a pretty old slide now, right? But my understanding is that some of the elements are still classified. So A, I don't know what they are, and B, even if I did, I wouldn't be able to tell you. But the key take-home message, and what you see at the bottom for those of you who are, and I can't do a laser pointer, right? Because most of this, a lot of this is remote. So at the bottom, what you are seeing is what is called the cyber kill chain, which itself has origins in the US Air Force kill chain. Don't want to go into details there. But the idea is that this is a sophisticated adversary. Sort of the rough version of the story is the following. A large defense contractor, not APL, their missile kind of systems people, 5 extremely prominent scientists working there got an email from the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, or at least what looked to be from that institute, saying that they had been nominated for the Outstanding Scientist of the Year or something like that award. And there was a PDF nomination form that they had to put some details in and send back, right? You heard Professor Bellowin talk about how these sophisticated adversaries do this. I can give you lots of other examples. Around the time of the Fukushima earthquake, right? Excel spreadsheets went to people in Japan that had a malware embedded, saying radiation measurements around Fukushima. This was to the scientists who were involved in the cleanup effort. Around the same time, the same malware was embedded in a PDF document that purported to be an appeal from the Tibetan government in exile to Tibetans worldwide, saying, let's sign this petition, saying Tibetan people should be sort of given their freedoms and things of that nature, right? So you can speculate who might be the adversary behind such an attack. But fairly sophisticated targeting, and in this case, the only reason it got detected was the fact that these were 5 really smart people. They talked to each other. Hey, did you know I've just been nominated? Oh, so have I. And they were like, really? All 5 of us working in the same unit have been nominated as the outstanding scientist by the same organization? They went to the security people set them up on a honeypot, had them open the email, and they tracked an adversary for 2 years. And the row you see in the middle, the CVEs, there were 40 such, these are all 0 days. The CVE numbers were given later. The adversary over a roughly 2-year period had 40 new 0 days that they used, because every state level, every good actor knows that just because they're in your system, it doesn't mean that the attack they used wouldn't be shut down 6 months later. So they were constantly keeping themselves fresh. And the implants they used to exfil, I believe, are still classified. So this is what you're trying to deal with. And unless, as I sort of go back to the previous slide, right? Unless you have this superwoman sitting in your threat intelligence SOC, you're not going to detect these kinds of things. So this is a game I like. The original inspiration for this were some slides from Gary Gagnon, which is about ice hockey, and that's not a game. Well, I grew up in India. When you say hockey to me, it means field hockey, but in the American context, it's hockey played on ice. The original slides were about that, but if you don't understand cricket or hockey, think of, again, I was about to say football. Think of soccer, right? The goalkeeper doesn't turn and face the goal. Look at the goal line and swat away, the soccer balls as they are about to cross the goal line, right? The goalkeeper looks outside. The goalie says, okay, what is the offense doing, right? Did their midfielder start running up? Did the left field, winger cross to the center, right? Where is the ball moving? Because you are constantly calculating what the attack vector might be, and you are sort of proactively, predictively trying to defend against that. You're not waiting till the ball has been kicked at the goal. That is simply too late. Right? Unfortunately, most of our cyber defense happens after the traffic comes into our firewall. Just, every major organization today has a threat hunting team. Why do they have a threat hunting team? Because the assumption is our defenses are not perfect, someone would have gotten through, right? So certainly, I'm not saying you wouldn't need threat hunting teams, but the idea is that hopefully with some AI, you can begin to sort of be more outward looking, be more predictive on the kind of things that may be coming down the pike and start to defend against them, right? So a good player sees the game as it evolves. And it's not just their own actions, but the actions that other people may or may not be taking. So what we've been trying to build over the last few years is a system that absorbs sensor data from the kind of places that you would expect to see, right? So these are your network sensors and firewalls and host sensors and whatnot. But we also look around at web forums, chat rooms, discussions, tweets, and we have tried, it's hard, dark web, right? To see what are people talking about in terms of potential future attacks, right? And brought to bear techniques. So if you would, we ingest knowledge from those sources as well as the traditional sensors, and then try to reason over them, much like an analyst would, to see if we can detect an attack. And in the process, we use this ontology called the Unified Cybersecurity Ontology. I will not get into the details of that. If any of you here are AI, semantic web, knowledge representation kind of aficionados, I'm happy to talk to you about this. Short version, we can express most of the things that something like STIX or attack can, but we can do it in a richer framework that is more amenable to first order logic and that kind of formal reasoning methods. So, in our current iteration, we can do what STIX 2.0 did. I know STIX has been evolving and doing new things, but the idea is that we can capture some of these higher level concepts like what is an attack? An attack is launched by an attacker. An attack may be part of a campaign. Every attack uses certain tools, sort of technologies and practices. An attack is visible because of certain kind of indicators. An attack may have a mitigation, etc. So we can capture these and not just capture and display them a la STIX or attack, but we can then feed them into a reasoner, into an AI system that can think about it and say, hey, I think this is happening, and I think this is how you should be reacting. So essentially, we detect potential new vulnerabilities from these sources that I talked to you about. From the data we are seeing from the sensors, we recognize the context of the systems and the potential attacks and intrusions that may be happening, and then we reason over them to identify actual attacks. And the one thing that we focused most of our initial attention on was deductive reasoning. So here's an example of the kind of deductive process you might do. You might say, okay, look, most analysts have certain background knowledge. I'm just going to capture it and represent that in my ontological framework, right? So there are new vulnerabilities that someone has discovered in a software, or basic facts like, household machines have DHCP addresses that are often compromised and used as zombies. Because they are DHCP addresses in household machines, say in Verizon's DHCP range, they are unlikely to be a server that someone would want to connect to. Then there is the observed state of the system. You can capture things like what software is installed, what versions, what processes are running, how much memory are they consuming, how many page faults are they causing, what files are they touching, how much traffic is being generated, what is the TTL of the packets. I mean, all kinds of indicators can be captured. You can also capture in this kind of a framework organizational policies, right? People in the asymmetric information systems group never interact with the outside travel agency, right? Believe it or not, one of the things that I'm pretty sure was an attack, I just discarded that email, was something that came to me allegedly, from our travel agency saying, you're for this such and such conference, here are the proposed bookings and things of that nature. Since I don't use that agency, I pretty much was sure that I should not be opening that proposed itinerary, right? But again, organizations often have policies about what communication is allowed, and you can capture those policies in this kind of an ontological framework. And then you can write rules deductive rules that say, if an email from a travel agency with an attachment went to a person in the group X and a process is running with the PID of this person that has known vulnerabilities that your scan of the dark web told you about, and it is making connections to previously unvisited hosts in the DHCP range of an etc. I mean, again, this is not perfect knowledge. This is not guaranteed attack, but this is the kind of thing that an analyst would think about and say, something may be happening here. Let me look. And this is the kind of thing that a machine that is reasoning can do much faster and alert analysts where they see things. So this is deduction, right? But then you can do more once you have things in this kind of a framework. And our research in this area is, so in that, we have several papers and even in some cases prototype systems that we can show. But here is where you can go with something like this. So that is deduction. But for those of you who still remember your logic course from college, you can also do induction or abduction. So let me give you an example of abduction, right? So let's say you knew that Chrome version whatever, right, has a certain vulnerability that manifests itself in certain way when a site is visited in a certain domain. You notice that something similar is happening, but you're not using Chrome, you are using Microsoft Edge. Now, in this case, actually, the abduction is relatively straightforward because Edge is also built on Chromium, right? So let me make the example harder. What if you're using Mozilla, Firefox, right? Well, that's not built on the same code base, but you can abduct, you can propose as a hypothesis that, well, perhaps Mozilla suffers from the same vulnerability. That's why I'm seeing this flaky behavior, right? Which is reported in Chrome, but hasn't been reported in Mozilla. So I don't have a deductive rule saying an attack is happening, but I can abduce that an attack may be happening. So it's basically saying in my graph, right? If you don't want to think of this as a reasoning and you want to think of this as subgraph isomorphism, which yes, is very, very hard to do in the general case, right? But what you're saying is that my subgraph is just missing an edge. Otherwise, it would have matched the graph exactly. So you can begin to do these kinds of things once the framework that we have created is in place and is actually ingesting all this data. So again, this is the kind of thing, research where you have to push the state of the art. Let me give you another example where you have to push the state of the art. So most of even the deductive reasoning today in formal systems in AI is not probabilistic, right? You essentially say, if A, B, C, then D. But really, for something like this to work at scale, you want to be able to say, well, I sort of have evidence of A, 90% certainty. I sort of have evidence of B, 85% certainty. I sort of kind of have evidence of C, 60% certainty. What's the probability that the consequent is also true? So probabilistic reasoning has been a known problem in AI for a very long time. It's just very, very hard to do at scale. So those of you who've played around with Markovian logics and things, I mean, you know how hard it is to do. So you need fundamental research, and I think this is a good motivating problem where there's a lot of ROI if you're able to crack those kinds of problems. So we built a prototype system. This was some work in collaboration with IBM Research, where they provided us significant funding, and we sort of collaborated with them, which kind of did this kind of thing, and actually worked on the ransomware example that Professor Bellowin was earlier talking about, right? So we know from reading about ransomware in textual sources that ransomware will typically download and upload software keys from external servers, and then it will try to modify sensitive files. And one of the first things most ransomwares do is to modify your master boot record. Right? These are facts we know because we have read this information automatically and ingested it, right? Then we can read reports saying, hey, there is a new ransomware called WannaCry that uses malformed SMB, so the eternal blue vulnerability, to gain access to a victim. We can be so those are things that you have already asserted in your knowledge graph. Your reasoner knows about it. Now you are dynamically asserting facts into your knowledge graph from the ingested network and host data. I noticed that, Snort tells me that I'm seeing malformed SMB packets, right? My Wireshark or whatever tells me that I'm seeing downloads from an IP address that I've never connected to before. I noticed that some files that are never touched are beginning to be modified. Host monitor tells me that, procmon tells me that. And then you essentially do this reasoning saying, in light of what I read and what I know, this is probably WannaCry. And then, and this is research that, so this is the part of the work we've mostly done, and the part that we are pushing forward is, and then we want to say, and what you should do while you alert the human, right? What you should do immediately is this. And we built a prototype, so you can see that, we're using, the attacker is doing an Nmap scan and then is sort of using the SMB vulnerability. And our monitor is, Snort agent is telling it that, hey, it sees Sportsnet scanning, it sees bad SMB traffic, it shows some downloads that it doesn't recognize. The file monitor now says, hey, there are some new files being created, and files that you have deemed as sensitive are being modified. The process monitor, typically, if someone begins to encrypt your files, your processor utilization will shoot up. So your process monitor could say, hey, processor utilization is shooting up, and effectively your system can now deduce that an attack is happening, right? Even though these are events that are temporarily and sort of potentially spatially separated happening on different machines, and we built a prototype system that could sort of detect this kind of an attack and also show you why it thought an attack was happening. And that's the other advantage of these kinds of systems. You could query the system and say, why did you come to this conclusion? And it can show you the proof chain it built, in effect, to say why. So that's sort of the overall picture. I do want to spend a little bit of time getting into some more technical details on the knowledge extraction part of it, right? So we want to be able to read text and find entities and their properties and their relations and the events that they are a part of, represent this in some general knowledge base with provenance and probabilities, even though we can't use probabilities right now. We want to be able to do, and I know there is a lot of people at APL that do this kind of work, just not in this domain, right? So you want to be able to do what is called entity co-reference resolution. You want to be able to say, the Anupam being referred to here is the same as the Professor Josie being referred to there, right? So you want to be able to say they're the same things. And then we want to be able to link these to external background knowledge bases, right? So for example, a cursory thing in Wikipedia will tell me that Kaspersky is, a Russian firm. And that may or may not be relevant to my defense posture, right? I mean, these days it is, but those are facts that I can ingest directly from Wikipedia, and Wikipedia very kindly makes it available in a format called Wikidata that we can just pull in. So, you want to be able to read text like this. I won't read the text, but it's describing a vulnerability. And you want to be able to then take the background knowledge that a human analyst has and construct a knowledge graph, right? In our UCO ontology. And I don't want to read this graph to you, but Flash was something that Professor Bellowin mentioned. So this is basically saying that, I don't know, the Chrome, Safari, and Edge are all browsers. So you can guess that this slide is about 2 years old now. And they all have this thing called the Adobe Flash Player. It also tells you that Safari is owned by Apple and Microsoft owns Edge. It should be an animation here. Right. So the blue edges are giving me what is called a users relationship. Safari uses Adobe Flash Player. Google Chrome uses Adobe Flash Player, right? The Adobe Flash Player uses the SpiderMonkey engine, which in turn uses an iframe to do something. There is something called the United Hacker Group, which has an attack called Replayer, which does this iframe business. So then you can see some relations that talk about how to mitigate an attack, right? So the attack is remote JavaScript execution. The SpiderMonkey engine causes that, but it can be mitigated by something called the Replayer blocker. The red link is an edge in the knowledge graph that says SpiderMonkey engine has vulnerability remote JavaScript execution. So what you want to do is to read text like this, and you can see the symbol of our friends who funded some of this research also in the neighborhood. I know you guys work with them too. You want to read something like this. These are examples of text they gave us. So, and these are not super secret. These are like after action reports, about 1.6 terabytes worth of after action, publicly available after action reports that say what an organization found out post facto about the malware, right? The idea is if we can perfect the techniques here, then we can be forward looking to see what is being discussed in blogs and forums and things like that. But you want to be able to see things like there is a group called Nikon. It uses spearphish documents with a certain vulnerability. There is a trick here though, right? Should the Nikon group be associated with suspicious email? Because there's sort of a lot of text separating that. And those are the kinds of sort of real research problems that you have to deal with, right? So we built a pipeline to take this kind of data, right? And to first do NER, so the named entity recognition. Nikon is a name, Microsoft is a name, Adobe is a name, Flash Player is a name, JavaScript is a name, etc. And then we built systems where you would do relationship extraction. This software has vulnerability, this vulnerability, right? This group uses this exploit, etc. So you want to build these kinds of things to create these knowledge graphs. Now, in addition to reading text documents, what we do here, and I alluded earlier to the fact that our UCO system sort of subsumes sticks. So we also read all the publicly available threat feeds that you are getting from taxi servers. So for those of you who are familiar, Sticks threat feeds are essentially JSON representations of the same kind of information without the relationship spelled out. We can ingest them also and add them to our knowledge graph. And one of the first places we demonstrated this was using sort of Twitter. We built a system called Cyber Twitter some years ago. So you might be saying, well, why do you need research? isn't there like a bunch of people doing NLP, and can't you just download Stanford's NER? And well, this is the result if you download Stanford's NER. Right? It thinks there is an organization called login service. Obviously, that doesn't work because you really want to be able to do something like this, which is what we do. Right? So the entities that we look out for are described here. For some, you need sophisticated NERs. For other things like IP addresses, frankly, you can just build regular expressions and capture them. So what we are doing is sort of building a combination of, in this case, CRF-based, but we've also tried some deep learning methods more recently that have given better results to read that text, as well as regular expressions to pick up things like IP addresses and hash and so on and so forth in a piece of text. We annotated about 54,000 words from these various sources, trained and tested, and are getting pretty good results. So the harder part is to extract relationships. And relationships are hard because Anupam Joshi and UMBC are mentioned right next to each other. And looking at the words in between, you can maybe say, yeah, okay, Anupam Joshi works at UMBC. Anupam Joshi is mentioned in the first line of the document. UMBC is mentioned in the 5,000th line of the document. And yeah, in between, there are words that represent a works relationship. Should you be drawing that inference or not, right? So it's a harder problem, but we've built systems to extract, and I don't want to trivialize this, right? In general, that is an extremely hard problem. So we worked first on a more restricted version of the problem, which is to say, what security-related relationships, especially those captured in frameworks like STIX and Attack, might exist between these two entities, right? So we're not asking we are only interested in whether something is a mitigation, something is an attack, something is a vulnerability, right? We're not interested in, oh, the cost of Microsoft Explorer is $5. We're just not interested in that relationship, so we don't even try to look for it. If you restrict the problem like this, you can actually build deep learning-based systems by essentially creating word embeddings representing the entities and training a deep network to say, given these two word embeddings, is there a relationship that explains them, right, or connects them? So we built this kind of a system and trained it using a large set of documents that our students annotated, and we are able to get fairly good results, right? So reading a text like this, we're able to pick up these kinds of relationships. Nikon targets spear phishing targets. It uses suspicious email. You don't see the relationship there, but there's a malware called Helsing that uses, has a particular hash, et cetera, right? So once again, you can look, the results are not as great as what you're getting for NER, but they're pretty reasonable. And in fact, in more recent work, we've kind of pushed these numbers up further. Before I move on to the final part of the talk, I do want to say something else, right? So I know we've been talking about how AI can be used to enhance cybersecurity. Well, every time you do that, if you think like a security analyst, you're saying, oh, you've just opened up another vulnerability. So what you've opened up now is data poisoning attacks. If I'm the adversary and I know you are doing this, I'm going to start putting fake documents on the net saying, hey, I found an attack on Microsoft Word that does this. And I'm just going to read it and say, oh, new attack on Microsoft Word, and then begin to take defensive actions that might actually stymie my system, right? So there are sort of these challenges. I can also deliberately give you fake information. Right? I could say, oh, the way to mitigate this attack is by shutting down port 80 on your server. instead of shutting down port 5034 or whatever it is. So in more recent work, and this is being written up for publication, so I didn't want to put any numbers up, but we are actually beginning to use some very interesting techniques to say, can I actually detect when someone is feeding me this kind of fake info? Can I detect these kinds of data poisonings that might be happening? But anyways, to continue, right? So again, these are actual texts we got from our friends at NSA after action reports. And you can see that this talks about the Helsing thing and what kind of tools that it is using. So you can extract this information and create a knowledge graph. This is what the knowledge graph extracted from this particular document looks like. But again, they gave us 1.2 or 1.6, I forget, terabytes worth of information. So you're going to read a lot of documents. And there's probably going to be a lot of different after action reports that are talking about the same malware, but perhaps adding new information every time. So it's not sufficient to say, oh, and then I write another one and I created another knowledge graph, right? What you really want to be able to do is to say, hey, I ran a bunch of these reports and these 100 of them are all talking about the same malware. So I will take the knowledge graphs I extracted from each one of them and fuse those knowledge graphs to create a single queryable source. And so this is the example of, this is the result of fusing those two knowledge graphs that I was showing you about. And now it has information from both those sources. So if an analyst is querying or a system is using it, you can do interesting things. So let me just end by giving you two simple things that were done by, well, at that time, people who were undergraduates. So this is about 2.5 years old right now. Lorenzo Neal, a Meyerhoff scholar who's now at North Carolina State doing his PhD. If there are any APL HR recruiters, he'll probably graduate in a year or so. You should think of hiring him, right? So Lorenzo was an undergraduate research assistant in my lab, and he took this tooling that our graduate students were developing and said, okay, every project in GitHub, and there's a lot of use of open source right now, has with it sort of this issue repository that says, what issues have been identified, including things like buffer overflows or, malformed inputs and things of that nature, right? So he used this to read all these repositories, construct knowledge graphs, and then he would go look at what. So you said, okay, I want to protect this system. So he would say, okay, what software do you have installed? Can I decompile and say what libraries is it calling? Are any of these open source libraries? And if they are, let me go pull from my knowledge base all the known vulnerabilities that are afflicting those libraries. And I'll just tell the analyst, hey, boss, if you're running this version of this software, you may have these problems, right? And that itself is good knowledge. So this was an undergraduate working over the summer. Here is another undergraduate. She since went to a defense contractor, came back, is doing her PhD, and you can't hire her because she was just hired by NSA. So, Priyanka, we were discovering that when we were looking at the dark web, most of the discussion of interest around attacks, especially attacks that are relevant to us in the US, was not happening in English, right? Were often happening in Eastern European languages written in Cyrillic. So, okay, zero-thoughter idea, let's throw that through Google Translate and apply our English tooling. Except, if you throw that through Google Translate, and I have one good example, which is that if you look at, if you pass through Google Translate, this little thing that there was a report saying that there was a virus that was cleaned, Google Translate thinks that you are talking about like the real virus and the real thing you do to clean it with a bleach or something like that. So that's what Google Translate puts out. So obviously that doesn't work. So she had this interesting idea, and she worked with some of our graduate students to say, if you have tagged data in English, and you have created a word embedding space. And for those of you who are not familiar, what you're essentially doing is creating a latent space that captures relationships between words. That's what word embeddings do. Very interesting technique developed around 2013 by Mikolov. So you have the latent space for English. Well, let me create directly by talking to a native Russian speaker. And we had another undergraduate who was a native Russian speaker. We said, well, why don't you translate a handful, a few tens of these sentences? And we said, okay, let me create the Russian embedding space about cybersecurity related data. And now I will find a mapping function because I know which documents here correspond to which documents there. I will find the mapping function in the embedded space. And so for any future documents, I will read them in Cyrillic, in Russian. I will map them directly. I will create the word embeddings in the Russian space. I will map them directly to the English space and then move it up through the translation thing. And then you get much better results, right? So again, this was another undergraduate. A little plug for UMBC, we are very good with undergraduates working in our labs, not just graduate students. So this was sort of another good example. What she's doing right now is fascinating, right? So she just published a paper late last year. So you can now actually use tools like this to create completely fictitious threat feeds. And we tested it by giving about 500 such documents to fairly senior security analysts working in the defense industry here. If a threat feed was true, they would correctly say, yeah, this is a real threat. For the threat feeds that we were generating, which were completely fake, they were like, their detection was 50% basically. So they were 50-50 on whether it was real or fake. So even fairly sophisticated analysts can be fooled by these kinds of tools that the NLP people, you may have heard about this. I mean, this is the same technology that is used by Google in the chatbots and all, right? How they generate these real sounding conversations and all, what are called large language models. So she used a well-known large language model, GPT-2, to generate fake tweets. I mean, a common example was she just gave it the first few words, the solar winds attack, and then it generated a completely real sort of sounding paragraph that had nothing to do with the real solar winds attack. It mentioned a completely different attack and a completely different way of getting in and so on and so forth. So, there's a lot of possibility here. So, yeah, these are some of the examples that I was talking to you about earlier. And that's my trophy. I thought I had a slide here that said questions, but let me stop here and see if there are any questions. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time today. And since I'm not on a computer, I can't see if anyone has posted anything.
So I think Jeff is going to look at the, so I think while folks on the web are trying to find out some questions, I have a question, Professor Joshi.
Yes, sir.
This is Ashutosh from Johns Hopkins, APL. So some of the technique that you mentioned, I work a lot on 5G security, which is more like network. Mm-hmm. So you have radio access network, edge cloud, you have SDN, virtualization, etc., right? And we're trying to find out how we can take advantage of AI to prevent the attacks. Not only reduce the time to detect and mitigate, but completely prevent. Yeah.
So I think that's a great question, and we can talk at greater length some time. But we are being challenged to do this on a big ARL project that we have, where we have to try and show the success of these kinds of techniques on small form factor devices like Jetson Nanos, right? In fact, for a version we did to secure smart homes with a local startup through TEDCO funding, we were trying to run some of this on a Raspberry Pi. Because when you're doing this on the edge, your compute capability tends to be limited, right? ARL would like to fly little micro drones and have them think about, hey, my bandwidth availability certainly decreased. Should I switch from the 5G backhaul to the LoRaWAN and feed it, dump the data to the soldier and have that soldier push it out, right? So we're building these kinds of systems where we are trying to detect these attacks on the edge and mitigate them by, for example, transcoding kind of ideas, or switching the network channels, or doing a different frequency hop. So there are possibilities dealing with edge devices, and especially with ORAN coming on, and SDRs. There is great scope here.
Yeah, I have a question. Ryan Pepito, APL. I was just wondering, what do you feel the biggest challenge is with AI that is stumping you, and I guess reaching the goals you're trying to achieve within the work that you are doing?
Okay, that's actually a fascinating question that probably deserves like a 30-minute speech by itself, since I don't have 30 minutes. Don't want to keep you guys from dinner. In short, what I'll say is this, right? This kind of research is hard because you really need to understand the domain and the AI technologies involved. So you can't say, well, I'm the cybersecurity guy. All I know is that if you call scikit-learn or PyTorch and give it this deep learning model, you actually have to understand what is being done and why it's being done, right? So if I just walk in and without collaborating with Dr. Dutta here, say, yeah, I'm going to do dwell time changes on the frequency hop, right? I may be completely breaking the system when I think I'm trying to defend. So I think that's a very big challenge, right? Getting the experts in AI and experts in some of these domains to talk together. And frankly, some of these AI challenges are generational challenges, right? So how humans think, how we reason, how we abuse, I mean, we have a foothold of it, but fundamentally, some of these are questions that you can go back and read papers in the 1930s about what it means to be intelligent. You can read papers from Searle in philosophy, right? On what does it mean to truly understand and know. So these are generational challenges. We're doing fairly straightforward stuff in terms of pushing the AI state. But if you say, what I really want to do is to augment the human analyst by creating something that almost looks like the analyst's natural intelligence, I don't have an answer. That's a big challenge. We're probably going to be spending my career, your career, and perhaps the career of some other people after that before we can get to that.
Is it on now? All right.
Yep.
Hi, good evening. Eric Holst, APL, AMDS, Air4J. Thanks for coming to speak. I was just curious if there's anything kind of at the intersection between, what we're discussing here, which is more kind of like technical cyber attacks compared to social media, or more kind of soft or psychological forms of, cyber engagement. If there's anything at the intersection of those two areas that you find interesting.
Yeah, so I guess let me start by saying the obvious, which is that a lot of people have been talking about misinformation or disinformation or whatever your favorite word is recently. We did some interesting work, how quickly time flies. Hurricane Sandy, right? I don't know if anyone here remembers Hurricane Sandy, but during Hurricane Sandy, people were actually, social media was beginning its sort of up inflection curve, right? So people were posting pictures on Facebook and whatnot and Twitter. Here is a shark swimming on the New Jersey Turnpike. here is a McDonald's in Virginia Beach completely underwater. And what we were saying was, can we detect that these are fakes? Right? And we had some good results. It was very topical, so got us some coverage in Wired and BBC and places like that, not just the normal journals where we publish this work. But I think the problem you are beginning to run into now is that your nation state adversaries are not necessarily confined to feeding a single piece of misinformation, right? What is more interesting is crafting of a narrative. Can I seed sequentially a little bit of misinformation, shades of truth, along with otherwise true information, to take your thinking along a certain direction, right? And we've seen this. I have zero clearances. I know some of you here may have clearances. You may know more than I, but one thing that was reported around the time of the 2016 election was this thing happened in Dallas, where there was social media activity that kind of was directed at the Muslim American population there, pointing out some issues of potential mistreatment or how laws may be framed to exclude them and things of that nature. So getting people agitated a little bit and suggesting that maybe there should be a demonstration to raise these concerns at such and such place on such and such time. Around the time the community began to sort of pick that idea up, allegedly the same sources began to post in other groups, you can guess which ones, that said, look, these people come from other countries, and then they want to impose their views on us, and they don't want to adapt, and they're going to do a big demonstration here, and we should show up. And a situation was created, right? So it's the same set of facts. I'm just mixing them slightly differently to take your thinking in a certain direction, right? I mean, I hate to be controversial, but the very unfortunate events that are happening in Ukraine right now, the Russian invasion, right? You can craft two stories with the same set of facts. In story one, an imperialist Russia, hell-bent on recreating its former Soviet empire, is trampling, right, the free rights of countries in its neighborhood to make whatever choices they want to associate with whoever they want. In narrative two, and you can see both of these not in the American media, but if you look media at the rest of the world, you're seeing both of these narratives, right? In the American media, you only see one narrative. The other narrative, which you don't see here very often, is America is creeping eastward after giving assurances, when the Soviet Union said, fine, we're giving up, let's just all be friends, etc. And they said, yeah, we will never, cause NATO to expand. And now slowly, one after the other, NATO is creeping next to our borders. What are we supposed to do? Same set of facts. Now you mix in a little bit of, information in different ways. So I think this is going to be an interesting, and we are interested in this problem, by the way. We're working with some linguists and all to identify how are narratives crafted. I mean, people in literature have studied this problem, right? How do you write a story? How do you expand the plot? But I think we have to get wise about this in the social media context, because a single piece of blatant disinformation is easy to detect, right? If someone posts and said, Professor Josie gave a talk about, I don't know, quantum computing at APL today, it's pretty easy to figure out that that's wrong, right? But if someone says, Professor Joshi's talk was entirely about novel methods to do deep learning for entity detection, well, there's a kernel of truth in that. But that was, and you can just combine these kinds. So anyways, that's for soft, that's the kind of thing that we're very interested in right now, talking to linguists and things of that nature.
Yeah, so there was a question from the web, and my computer's about to shut down. Let's see if I can get it from my pad. Chat. Yeah. Here we go. So with the use of the Internet of Things at an industrial scale, it seems that this is encouraging adversaries to use fake IoTs. And so the question is, how can you use AI to isolate some of the adversarial IoTs?
Again, that's sort of a talk by itself. Let me give you an example of a specific piece of work we did that uses the same kind of technology. So I talked to you earlier about word embeddings really describing a latent space of relationships between words. So think about any real IoT or CPS system that operates in the physical world. It operates under certain physical constraints, right? So go back to Stuxnet. Those centrifuges are supposed to spin at a certain speed with very tight tolerances. If I remember, the tolerance is supposed to be 5%, right? And they should, even though a Siemens PLC is getting completely valid and validated commands saying that they should spin at 100% their normal rate, physics tells you that that is wrong, right? Now, of course, for a given system, you can query the experts and say, how do you come up, tell me the rules that the system should operate in. But realistically, with IoT, as you said, penetrating all aspects of our life, that's going to be hard. So what we said was, can we do the same class of techniques to see the latent space that is defined by the physics and the domain, right? So we took a car. One of my graduate students instrumented it, and IoT systems present an interesting example. I can't tell my graduate student, drive the car normally, and then to show an attack, drive the car at 100 miles an hour, or well, not 100, 65 miles an hour or 95, and open your door. Not allowed to do that, right? No IRB would let me do that, and I wouldn't do that. But what you can do is you can say, okay, let's drive the car under normal conditions, whatever physics says, whatever the real world usage says. And in this case, he drove the car for about 25, 30 hours in a variety of conditions. And you're gathering data from the OBD port essentially on a per second basis. So this is huge data. And then you build deep learning models to extract the latent space, to say, look, you may have, terabytes of data, but really there are only 5 or 6 real physical things. You're driving on a highway at normal speed, you're driving in rain, you're driving in snow, you're driving, in city streets, you're parked. There's 6, 7, 8, 10 things like that that represent normal. And I can, using deep learning techniques, identify normal. So if you now use some fake IoT systems or commands to try to push me out of that normal envelope, I can see whether my current state is projectable into any of these underlying latent spaces. And if it's not, I will stop it. So that's one example, but again, there's lots of different ways of doing this. Thank you very much. Once again, I appreciate your calling me today.
Thank you, Professor Joshi, for that invigorating and exciting, interesting talk. We have a token of our appreciation that we will be presenting to you. I can read it today. It's not available today, but we'll be mailing this to you. But in appreciation for your talk, we will be presenting you with a plaque that reads as follows. The ACM Baltimore Chapter extends its appreciation to Professor Anupam Josie for delivering an invited talk, ACM Baltimore Chapter Inaugural Seminar 2022, Laurel, Maryland, April 20, 2022. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That kind of concludes the talks. We just have few housekeeping. Any questions, please, again, send it to the chat. I'd like to acknowledge a few of my other colleagues who could not be here today. Random Goen, he's our webmaster of ACM Baltimore chapter. Tamim Sakur, he's the secretary for ACM Baltimore chapter. He couldn't be here today. He's not feeling well. And Ken Smith from Membership Development Chair from Johns Hopkins University, he was online. What I was trying to say is, you see 3 of us here, and 3 of them I just introduced, but we have a lot of other activities that we're planning to do. So if you're interested, please let us know. You can go to Baltimore chapter website and express your interest. People over here and people who are watching, mostly in DMV area, if you're here like DC, Maryland, and Virginia. There are a lot of things we have to do, and Wale and Jeff, please feel free to chime in. I kind of showed this slide last time, and today we made little progress by involving UMBC. Professor Josie was kind enough to come and give a talk on site, and he has also offered to have some future ACM seminar in his university. So we are exploring that. Obviously, we already connected with Johns Hopkins, now the UMBC. In Worcester, Maryland, College Park, I was reaching out to Professor Jonathan Katz and other universities like Morgan State, Howard, George Washington, George Mason, Virginia Tech, right? There are many other universities around. We like to rotate these seminars. So if anybody hearing from those universities, please let us know. We're trying to make this seminar monthly. We are hoping we're going to have sometime in May. Another one, we are reaching out to potential speakers. Today's topic was mostly on the security, which we heard from the stalwarts. The Institute for SEO Autonomy, this is another institute. Professor Jim Bellingham was here last time. He was the executive director. Tony Deborah and Cara Lapointe, they're also technically sponsoring this. There are a lot of ways you can develop, and Wale has been a champion of this within APL, at least in terms of professional development for ACM members or IEEE members in that sense. Maybe he can say a few words about that. Last time I showed many ways you can contribute to ACM activities, collaborate with other institutions like IEEE, take any leadership roles. There are many ways you can be, you can get the benefits by networking and also technical opportunity. I already talked about the other universities, research labs. MITRE, for example, I was talking to Charles Clancy. He has been pretty active in many of the IEEE conferences. He's also interested to collaborate with us. I was telling there are 2 activities we are going to do now, 5G NextG Summit and Open RAN Summit that's coming up. We are also trying to open a SIG Mobile chapter. And Professor Josie, this is something I haven't talked to you. I've been talking to SIG Mobile folks to see if we can bring Mobicom 2023 or 2024 to Baltimore area, right? That'll be, and I'm talking to Victor Wale and excellent. So, all right, so let's do that, because it's good to have some conference, flagship conference. I don't think they ever did Mobicom in this area. So I was talking to Shimon Banerjee and Victor Wale. So we have to write a proposal and win the proposal, obviously. Open RAN Summit, May 26th, NextG Summit. So I already showed this. Please submit your proposals. This is the Open RAN Summit again. These are all free events, so please do participate. So with that, Wale and Jeff, you'd like to say a few words? Vote of thanks.
Yeah, I want to thank everybody for coming as well, just to echo what Ashutosh just said. If you are not a member of ACM, I really want to encourage you to join and develop your professional path, to becoming a fellow of ACM down the road. And if you have colleagues or people in your network, encourage them to become members of ACM as well. We need to grow this organization because this is the backbone of what we all do for this country. this country is really built on technology, and we cannot become the second nation in this world. It's in the world. It's just not going to happen when I'm alive. And the question is, what are we doing to make sure that we continue, the US continues to be the #1 technical knowledge in the world? And it all depends on us in this room. Let's build the momentum. Let's reach out to our colleagues and make things happen for the country. Thank you.
Just one other thought or comment that beyond joining the ACM, we invite you to become involved in the ACM. And Ashutosh called out a number of ways that you could be actively involved. And so we encourage you to join and to become active and bring your talent and your ideas and your energy to the organization.
Yeah, thank you for sharing it. And I just want to add to what Wale said. Whatever we are doing, not only for this country, we are doing for the humanity. So ACM is a worldwide organization. We can lead the way, right? So by example, so that way we can influence others in the world as well for the betterment of the humanity, right, in technological ways. So, so please come forward, take the leadership. The other thing is these talks will be available. These are all recorded. They'll be available in ACM YouTube channel. So I'd like to thank the ACM headquarters staff, Shanita, Jaswal, and other folks who have helped all the way. I'd like to thank my APL colleagues who are up there, David and Mitch, Christine, other folks, Amy, who helped us organize this event. I'd like to thank all the people who are here on site today, all the people from across the world who have been dialing in and stayed for the last 3 hours, and hope to see many of you, all of you in the next event. And most of you may be in person if you are in the neighborhood, or just drive down from New Jersey, Philadelphia, wherever you are. With that, I think we should close. Unless anybody has any question, please let us know on site. All right, so that kind of ends our talk, and let's thank the speakers again and all the attendees and audience and volunteers. Yeah.